Row upon row of jars. In the 80s, my uncle worked as an insurance adjuster. A big part of his job was to visit customers' homes after lightning strikes, hailstorms, and tornadoes, and assess the damage for the company. One afternoon, after a violent thunderstorm, he was called out to a sagging, Civil War era house in a remote area miles from town. It's what I call a Boo Radley house, the kind where the windows seem to watch you like dark eyes, fading, pale yellow paint, weedy yard, ancient trees, falling down barns and outbuildings, the remnants of a once beautiful farm. An old woman lived there alone. My uncle said she seemed nice, if a little wispy and vacant. It seemed likely to him that she hadn't had human contact in a while. She invited him inside, and the place was much as he expected, neatly kept but musty smelling. An old piano forte in a corner, lots of crocheted doilies and porcelain figurines. A pair of sleepy cats curled up together in a chair, two more on the couch. Pretty much your standard Hollywood old lady house set. The woman offered my uncle a cup of milky coffee, and one of the cats climbed into his lap as they chatted about the storm. When he'd finished his coffee, my uncle got to work examining the exterior of the house. Nothing, quite a bit of damage to the roof shingles, and a gutter partially detached by the storm's thrashing winds. When he finished assessing the exterior of the house, the old woman asked him if he would mind following her up to the attic. She was concerned that the loose shingles on the roof might cause some leakage. "I store my dearest treasures up there," she said. "I couldn't bear to see them damaged." My uncle followed the woman up the narrow steps to the attic, noting an odd, sharp smell as she opened the door at the top of the stairs. The attic was a dim room, with a vaulted ceiling. A small stained glass window let in a bit of light, and painted the rough wooden floors with rainbowy color. But it wasn't until the old woman flipped the light switch that my uncle got a look at her dearest treasures. The attic walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves, each shelf holding rows of clear mason jars. At first, my uncle thought this must be where she stored her home canned vegetables and preserves, but as he looked closer, his scalp prickled. Each jar held a tiny dead kitten. They looked newborn, maybe a day old, their tiny eyes still shut, and their little bodies curled in the fetal position. Rows and rows and rows of them. At least 100, maybe more. My uncle stammered something about making sure to note her concerns about the roof leakage in his report, and got out of that house as fast as he could. We've talked about this many times, and we've come to the conclusion that, based on the four apparently happy and well cared for cats he saw in her living room, that the jars probably held kittens who had died shortly after birth. She lived in the house for decades, and when the farm was up and running, there were probably a lot of barn cats having litter after litter of kittens. She probably felt she was memorializing the ones who didn't make it. At least that's what we hoped. But my uncle sure as hell never went back there again. Our farm has been a hotbed lately. Me and my father's farm sits 30 miles from the biggest city in our area. Otherwise, there's a town with nothing but trashed houses a mile from us, where gangs usually hang out and whatever. At around the same time, this main story took place. We had stuff happen such as where a red car would be booking along some railroad tracks across a field from us. Then gunshots and yelling would ensue. But that's another story. There was a time about 5 months ago. Our farm felt like it was being watched constantly. The first thing that occurred was when we were out sitting by the fire at midnight, with the full moon bringing out the coyotes and lighting up so much land that it was almost difficult to believe it was midnight and not just the sun beginning to set. It gave you the feeling of being refreshed, and the cool breeze would carry stress away. Then, of course, something had to happen to ruin a great night. It started as an old Chevy slowing down on the road beyond the gravel driveway 50 yards away, right in front of our driveway. Okay, he's just gonna turn into the driveway and turn around to go the other way, I thought. Nope. He eventually sped up and went on. 10 minutes later, same thing happened. This was odd. It started getting really suspicious when he did it a third time. By then, we knew he was going all the way around to the main highway, then turning onto a shortcut dirt road, and onto the county road we live upon. He did it a fourth time until we got a sheriff to patrol around out there. Then the little shit in the old truck didn't go by anymore as far as I know. They didn't find anything that night, but at least a week later, when we thought it was done, it wasn't. First of all, for some probably helpful information to help imagine this, our home has tall bushes all around it, with a little patch of woods in the back of it. And beyond that is wildlife refuge, with a lake back there and a creek kinda runs by our house. The only spot without bushes that you can enter easily is where the driveway is. Our home is encased by these bushes, and we don't exactly live right by the road. Anyways, I'm out beyond the bushes, home alone, in our kind of pasture land at around evening, when I see a blue F-150 kind of pickup truck, who slows down and turns into our driveway. He stops for a second, and suddenly I get a feeling that he's looking for me. I'm hiding behind a birch tree, staring his truck down through the leaves. Then he drives the rest of the way in, and I'm going hide-and-seek mode as I fall behind the tree as he advances further. Then I see him clearly as he steps out. Sweatshirt, jeans, kind of flowing hair that's parted in the middle and flowing back. Look like a 60-year-old man at least. Mind you, I'm hiding behind the bush now and watching him as I'm crouched down, with a Bowie knife in a sheath as only protection. I'm decently fit for running and very lightweight for a 14-year-old, so I could simply sneak away from him or something like that. He curiously walks around our yard, darting his head around like he's looking for me. He goes behind the house, but doesn't go the rest of our 8 acres searching for me. At this point, I'm thinking I must have fooled him by looking like I was going into the yard while actually behind the tree opposite side from him. Eventually, he gets back to his truck and drives away. We also have our closest and very trustworthy neighbor across the east of us, so I have no clue if he saw the same damn thing. I called my dad afterwards about it. When he got home, we went to our neighbor and talked about it. The neighbor thought it was a guy who was locally known to steal, but in my mind, I didn't think that. I had a feeling he was going for me. I look over my shoulder more now, though, knowing that our farm is likely being watched by more than just coyotes, waiting to get our chicken. Wrong address. This is my first post on Reddit ever. I was never a great writer, so I apologize in advance if it's not the greatest piece ever. A bit of background. I'm a 28-year-old female, and at the time, I was working as an equine veterinarian technician, horse nurse basically in New Jersey. The practice I worked for was an ambulatory, meaning we drove farm to farm treating horses. I traveled with a young mid-30s male vet every day, named Dave. I always drove and he sat shotgun typing medical records. This was a couple years ago, so the details are a tad fuzzy. We had an appointment scheduled to go out to a farm we had never been to before. I was familiar with the area, since I had grown up not far from there, and since I drove all these back roads for my job. I'd been down the road of the address many times before. We typed the address into the GPS anyways, just to be sure we got to the right place so we wouldn't be late. We were driving along the road and passed a small horse farm on the right, one we had been to before. The address was a different number, so we kept driving. Across the street, there was a driveway which had no trespassing signs. The address we were going to was the driveway directly after that. We pulled in and saw a house, but it was clear that there were no horses there, so we started to question if the receptionist had taken down the wrong address when making the appointment. The driveway continued on past the house, so we followed it. We passed a couple of sheds, then the driveway went between a few trees, and came to another house, which also didn't appear to have any horses, then turned left back towards the road. Now I'm figuring we're not in the right place, and Dave agrees. We are stopped there in front of the last house trying to figure out what to do when suddenly, 2 men get out of a truck sitting in the driveway. Dave, a naive Midwesterner who is sometimes a little too trusting, decides to roll down the window and ask for directions. The men are starting towards us, seeming to size themselves up to appear larger and start circling the truck. Now I'm getting nervous. One man goes to stand behind the truck. I quickly lock the doors as the other man approaches Dave's window. Dave greets him, explains that we are lost, and asks if he can give us directions to the address we are looking for. The man just keeps staring at him with his pissed off look on his face. Thinking maybe he didn't hear him, Dave repeats himself. Before he can finish, the man interrupts him and says, "I heard you the first time. What the fuck are you doing here?" Now I'm shitting myself. This guy's a lot bigger than Dave and I'm only 5'4", so I'm obviously no match for this guy and his buddy, who is still pacing back and forth behind our truck. Dave starts stammering that we are vets and that we're looking for our appointment. The man says we look too young to be vets, and he says he doesn't believe us and wants proof. Dave gives him a business card, but he is still not convinced. He then shows the man our computer with all our scheduled appointments. The man, still not looking entirely convinced, then tells us we are lucky we drove up while he was outside, because he usually pulls a gun on trespassers, still giving us that angry, pissed off expression. Suddenly, my phone starts ringing. It's another one of our clients calling because her horse is coalescing. I'm relieved to be talking to someone else, but try to keep it cool, and admittedly, I was so distracted by this man and his friend, who was still behind the truck. The man is eyeing me, so not wanting to make the situation worse, I tell her we'll call her back, and the colic seems mild and she has it under control for the time being. While I was busy on the phone, Dave told the man the name of the client whose address we were looking for, and that seemed to change his mood. He told us that her house was at the farm across the street, and then told us about his donkey that he used to have and the vet, recently retired, that he used to use. He then proceeded to tell us again that he regularly pulls his gun on anyone that finds their way onto his property, and again reiterates how lucky we were to catch him outside. He also makes sure to tell us that he's a retired recon Marine and would have no problem killing someone. He gives us permission to follow his driveway back out to the road. As we head out, I feel happy to be alive. As we pull out of the drive, I realize it was the driveway with all of the no trespassing signs. We finally make it to the appointment and tell the client about our adventure, trying to find her address. She tells us, "Oh yeah, that's Rocky Rick. He's a bit rough around the edges, usually pulls a gun on people. I try not to mess with him. So, Rocky Rick, let's not meet ever again." Creepy farmer dude. So, this was about 6 years ago, when my friend Anthony and I were 18 years old. Ant and I were good friends, and we would spend a lot of our time just driving around town. We lived in a smaller upscale area where nothing ever happened. Just a few miles away in the next town over was the farmland. It was a bunch of farms, ranches, and really old homes. There were always stories about creepy farmers from there. So anyways, one day, during our driving adventures, we ended up in the back roads of the farmland, and ended up finding a small dirt road that leads to a really nice scenic area. We stopped, checked it out, and was really into photography at the time, and thought it would be a good idea to come back to the location for some pictures. We were outside of the car just kinda walking around, exploring. Now, this dirt road was about 2 miles long, and there was only one house on the outside of the car, just kinda walking around one house on the road. It was a big old house, and it didn't look like anyone was living there. Then about a mile down from the home was the end of the road, which was surrounded by small grassy hills, and just beyond the hills was a small wooded area with huge trees. Anywho, as Ant and I are doing some exploring, we see this old beat up Dodge Durango sitting just outside the wooded area. We didn't think much of it. There were usually a lot of beat up abandoned cars in the farmland. Just as we're about to start walking back to the car, we see an old dude, maybe in his 50s, walking around the wooded area with a black trash bag. The bag was obviously full of something. The man saw us and then just started watching us. He didn't move an inch. He was maybe 100 feet away from us at the time, but it felt as if he was staring us in the eyes. Ant and I got a bit creeped out and went back to the car and left. A few days later in the morning, we headed back to the dirt road for some photos. It was around 6 a.m. and the sun was just about to rise. We got there, joked about seeing the creepy old dude, and then started taking photos again. We were on top of a hill and maybe 300 feet from the car. We had been there about an hour or so, and then all of a sudden we saw the Dodge Durango coming down the road. It was the exact one we had seen the other day. I pointed it out to Ant, and he didn't seem to care one bit. I, on the other hand, was a bit worried. Why was he coming down here again? Would he recognize us? That's when he pulled directly behind our car. He pulled up and just sat in his vehicle. He didn't get out, didn't do much of anything. After maybe 30 minutes, we headed back to the car. Aunt was now a bit worried, since this farmer guy was still right behind our car. When we walked up to the car, we got a crystal clear look at him. He was definitely in his 50s, had lots of white scruff on his face, and wearing a black coat. He gave us a look up and down. He had just the meanest look on him. He just looked angry, and it full of hate. We got in the car real quick and took off. Then he started to chase us. We were going down the road at maybe 30 miles per hour. It felt a lot quicker, since our little car was so bumpy on the dirt road. The guy was super close to us, maybe a foot or two behind us at all times. He had his high beams on. Even though we kicked out a cloud of dust, we couldn't seem to lose sight of the guy. We got to the main road, and when we went to turn right, he also turned at the exact same time. He was now driving on the wrong side of the road, and he was just staring at us from his car. As we were right next to him, he pulled out a knife and starts pointing it at us. He then passed us, cut us off, and we arrived at a stoplight. He was in front of us, and then we saw his reverse lights come on. Another car that had pulled up next to us, which was the only other car we'd seen all morning, started honking his horn. The farmer was not stopping. He was still reversing, and threw the car in reverse and backed up and pulled onto the shoulder. Once we had some distance between us, Aunt gunned it, and we got in front of the farmer man. We were on a pretty wide open and empty highway, but there were still stoplights every mile or so. After we got back in front, we started doing about 100 miles per hour to get away from the guy. He was still on our asses though, and wasn't letting up. We were coming up on a light. It turned red, and we barely made it. The farmer was maybe 2 seconds behind us now, and we thought he would stop at the light. No! He blew right through it. He had now caught up to us again, and right next to us, he started slowly drifting into our lane, and Anne hit the brakes for whatever reason. The farmer man started swerving. He ran right into a guardrail. I still remember all the dust and debris flying out from behind him. We made a U-turn and took off back to our side of town. On the way back, we called the police. Told them everything about what had just happened and how we even saw him with some trash bags the other day. We made it home in one piece, thankfully. We couldn't believe what had just happened. We were still trying to figure out why he did all that stuff. About 30 minutes later, we got a call from the police. They were asking if we knew why he was chasing us. We told them we had no idea, and we had never met him before, and we'd only seen him that one other time. The officer told us the guy was drunk, and was also being arrested for warrants. He also wanted us to fill out a statement about what we'd gone through. We never found out anything other than what we were told. That was about 6 years ago, and I still have to drive past that dirt road every now and then. Not a single time that I've driven past that road without thinking about how we were chased down by some creepy dude. The one home that was there was since been torn down. There's always talk in the community about building big fancy homes down there. Aunt and I met up again recently and joked about it. We still wanted to find out what was in those trash bags, but we didn't want to go back down there. My encounter on a Hare Krishna farm. I graduated high school almost a year ago. I really had no urge to attend college or the military, and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before me. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of called WWOOF.com, Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee, and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south. I got there and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought on Craigslist for $500. Later on, I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, self-absorbed, condescending, right out of college but vapid as shit hipsters. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversation about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I'd been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was going to really get involved with the farming and throw himself into the Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character. His sentences punctuated with an or and like, given his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of my friends I left back home. We became fast friends, as he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when he spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and of course, drugs. Every now and then, he brought up subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me he'd come to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learned Reiki meditation, a form of medication used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me he believed he had once used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure a week more of this. A couple days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about Waco, David Koresh, and the botched sage by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged. The government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth. That's so fucked up. I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopathic cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject, and I just explained to him, and now he's telling me I'm wrong and that Koresh was martyr? This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After half an hour of this absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation with a fucking lunatic, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket praying I had grabbed my knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk around my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it and turned around so he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what had happened, and that we had to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm anyways. I felt bad snitching on the guy. He was in a fairly desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends either. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years, and he had come here to get sober. I found it very strange that he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by, and this whole encounter kind of faded from my conscious. Late one night, I got a text. Hey, this is Michael. We can get my car out for $280. Want to go traveling? I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked me up on Facebook or something like that. A few nights later, I was in the temple office using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a loud banging coming from a barn. I can remember thinking it must be an animal, but also thinking it must be a pretty big one to make such a noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock. but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walking around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know it's gross, but I'm the only one who uses that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in the corner of my kitchen facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make, something you would hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo. This noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with his Ricky meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is that he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained me and Michael's history and what had happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about him. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly afterwards. Calling the police was really frowned upon since I believe many of the old hippies thought they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either. I couldn't sleep, knowing Michael might be out there in those woods angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me. If you feel this was too long and could easily be abridged, let me know. I've just been looking to tell the story for a while.